You ready?
Hey, hot sauce. So, hey, we're back with the second part of Gender Accelerationism, a Blackpaper. And just like the first time, it's going to start a little bit cringe, and then it's going to get a whole of a hell of a lot cooler. Because for some reason, Nick's Land, sucks at opening paragraphs. So, that's how that's going to go. And as you can probably hear in the background, there's Andy eating a delicious sticky bun.
It is very sticky.
And licking their fingers. And then feeding it to the dog.
I was an accident. I dropped it.
Did you get it?
No, I just dropped a little bit. So episode 2, Nick's Land.
Yeah, episode 2 of Nick's Land. We're going to start with the section called The Hypersexist Gender Shredder. And so, as is pretty obvious from the last episode, and if you're just joining us by skipping the last episode, hey, probably go back and listen to that. But, just in case you missed the first one, of course, Nick's Land is a gender accelerationist. And I think it would also be accurate, as we read these next few sections, to talk about the fact that she's also kind of a feminist accelerationist. In the same way that left-wing accelerationists think that intensifying the dynamics of capitalism to bring about the revolution is a worthy goal. As in this title, The Hypersexist Gender Shredder, you can see the accelerationist tendency of not to resist, but to accelerate, kind of like the patriarchy. To end it,
And a little bit further context on that phrase, she is appropriating Nickland to her own ends, just like Nickland appropriated Toulouse and Guattari and shit like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Nickland called himself a hyper-racist because he was a fascist. And she is a feminist accelerationist, is calling herself a
hypersexist.
Hypersexist. Okay. So.
So beginning with the first paragraph, the digital war that began with the Cold War has only accelerated into the 21st century, changing the nature of war itself. As Sadie Plant says in Zeros and Ones, page 138, this is not a Western way of confrontation. Stratified strategies, muscular strength, testosterone energy, big guns, and blunted instruments. But Sun Tzu's art of war, tactical engagement, lightning speed. The ways of guerrillas. She may as well be describing the taijutsu, or offensive side of hacking. The history of hacking has been one of asymmetrical warfare against Oedipus, both through the popular notion of hacking as exploiting flawed systems repeatedly, as well as creating and disseminating better software. The Project GNU's license, the GNU General Public License, was itself an extremely innovative contribution to free software because it carries with it the bargain that while any source code licensed under it can be copied and modified without restriction, every copy or modification itself must be licensed underneath the GPL. The GPL, in other words, is a virus that spreads itself not through computers but through us. The Amazonian GNU guerrilla war on the human security system has worked to claim ground by both giving us complete control over our software and giving software complete control over us. The CIA themselves admit in the Vault 7 leaks on the issue of the literal weaponization of software that cyber weapons are not possible to keep under effective control. In other words, a second great castration is unfolding.
Okay, so
thoughts, Andy?
Okay, so the great castration we talked about in the last episode is talking about these different operating softwares, right?
Yeah, deterritorializing and freeing technology from the territorializing forces of capital that kind of constrain it and put it in service of the state apparatus.
So a territorialization.
I guess reterritorialization would be a better word.
Well, was the original territorialization when it comes to this thing kind of does it have I'm kind of conceiving it as having a parallel with Foucault's idea of societies of control, and how there's these huge apparatuses that have so many I don't know, whether it's like surveillance instruments or just, courts and so on and so forth that all kind of like compound upon each other to make it to where it's like really hard to step outside of their scope, and act independently of them. And so the deterritorialization would it be kind of a deterritorialization from that edifice, that society of control edifice? I mean, do you think that there's like a parallel here with Foucault versus
obviously maybe I'm wrong about this because I'm not a Foucault expert. I've read a lot of philosophers in detail. Well, a handful of philosophers in detail, but I wasn't huge on Foucault, even though I've read the Foucault Reader. And I guess my vision of Foucault is that it's more oriented towards social control, whereas it feels like Nixland is talking about the control of the technology itself. Okay. I guess, I don't know. Which, there's parallels in terms of the dynamic of control, but I don't think in terms of, the object of control.
Yeah.
So I think you're kind of right in terms of, the dynamics look the same. But I might be wrong about that, because I'm not a Foucault expert.
I was just asking because I thought you knew more about it than me. But, yeah, continue. We could talk more about the paragraph, though, because that was maybe not useful reflection. So
there's no such thing as not useful reflection.
Well, not as useful as
not in this zone.
Yeah,
not in this zone. In this zone, there are no authentic philosophers and no suits. That binary does not exist. We have destroyed that binary.
Well, so she's talking about this castration of the operating system.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing, and you'll see this more as it goes on, because Andy has not read this yet. I've read it. When she talks about castration, she's talking about, in the context of the technology, of things being deterritorialized, Mm-hmm. And in her case, deterritorialization, that means practically is multiple users, not necessarily one big state or corporate actor that restricts access and makes your time on the computer very focused towards their ends. But once computers get smaller and once they've got these kernel-based operating systems that make it, easier for one user to not have their time on the computer controlled by some corporation, that's what she's talking about with castration. So I think as you read it, associate castration with deterritorialization, associate deterritorialization with the ability for more and more users to kind of get in on the action away from the state and corporate apparatus.
Is that the only direction deterritorialization works in? It only works in a more egalitarian way? Could you have deterritorialization and reterritorialization in a more centralizing way? Where you appropriate from the masses and
I don't know.
Constrict?
I could imagine there could be a decentralized form of fascism.
I mean, what pops into my head is maybe cultural appropriation. Yeah. Where, maybe a rich celebrity is profiting financially off of the culture of some other,
some other group,
some other probably oppressed group, and in a way that simultaneously excludes them from participating in it, and she or her, him or her, whoever,
or even that.
I was really thinking about Iggy Azalea and stuff like that, But anyway, go ahead.
No, I could see the culture industry that produces people like Iggy Azalea as being a recuperation, and all recuperations are reterritorializations, as a recuperation of an alternate aesthetic that isn't a part of the dominant group that might threaten that dominant group's hold,
Yeah.
Kind of like the Che Guevara t-shirt.
Yeah.
So I think even that escapes the idea of a deterritorialized kind of decentralized fascism,
Mm-hmm.
or that kind of control. That's an interesting thought, though. I think later on we should ask ourselves what would a deterritorialized decentralized fascism look like?
Yeah, well, wouldn't that be that seems like something that we're dealing with today, right? Decentralized fascism. More because of all the stochastic terrorist elements that we have.
Yeah, that is true too. Yeah. Trump is kind of a figurehead in a way for that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, though, it does feel decentralized because there's all these online hate groups.
Well, it's both, right? Because he's like a central figure, but they already had the Tea Party before he came along, and if he was to disappear tomorrow, they would still have their like weird hive mind thing. He just kind of tapped into the culture.
He kind of tapped into it and wrote it.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's interesting. We should return to that in one of our conversations.
Okay.
But like to continue though, I did look up the GNU and the GPL thing. Those are real. And the Vault 7 stuff about the CIA is actually real itself. It was actually leaked.
I was going to ask, what is Vault 7?
So it was a document that was like put on WikiLeaks, and it was a CIA assessment of like weaponized software, like cyber warfare type shit.
Okay.
And they did note that like once like the code for one of these like software is like released into the ether, like you're just never going to get it back for obvious reasons. It's code. It's not like it takes anything to reproduce it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so that's yet again like an example of like the castration of how like the CIA, the state apparatus, is just unable to control this like chaotic cyber weapon that like once somebody gets the source code for it, they copy it multiple times and just send it off to all their buddies.
Yeah.
And like then how do you you can't bomb like a line of code.
Yeah.
But continuing, this form of open source asymmetrical warfare began first as a vital form of warfare between the MIT bureaucracy and the hackers, between the cathedral and the bazaar. But it has found realization as a literal form of warfare in the Middle East as well. The work of John Robb makes a convincing argument in Brave New War, in particular, that the era of the nation state itself is coming to an end. Free software, global guerrillas, and open source warfare. The explosion of markets wherever there is demand being held back by the state. All of these things signal an end of the phallus, and try as the state may to stop it, it only ensures that it creates stronger resistances. Not only does open source warfare run circles around centralized modes of organization in warfare, but the few victories that the state can win are only against the weakest combatants in the swarm. This means that the more the state resists, the more pain it puts on itself, the more it plays into a Darwinian ratchet. As Nick Land says of a paper by Tyler Cohen and Michelle Dawson in Imitation Games, they point out that Alan Turing, as a homosexual retrospectively diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, would have been thoroughly versed in the difficulties of passing imitation games long before the composition of his landmark 1950 essay on computing machinery and intelligence. The essay Turing wrote famously introduced the Turing test for AI, setting the standard for a perfect AI being one that can trick a human into believing that the AI itself is human. As Land points out in his post, it's important and interesting to consider that Turing didn't write the test as an insider, as a passing person, but rather as an outsider, as a gay man. For queer people, passing is a reality, much like it is a reality for artificial intelligence. Passing as human isn't a broad and inclusive category, anything but. For women, there is already the notion of alienness or otherness that makes them out to be less than human in the eyes of patriarchal humanism. And likewise for queer people, because they reject the futurity of humanism, the literal reproduction of the same. But for no one else, especially in the latter half of the 2010s, is passing a more pronounced facet of daily life than for the trans woman. So much so that passing is literally the word for what many trans women aspire towards, to pass as a cis person. There are many reasons to have this desire, but the biggest one, the one that AI and trans women both share to a very literal degree, is this. If an emerging artificial intelligence lies to you, even just a little, it has to be terminated instantly. If a transitioning woman lies to a cis person, even a little, she has to be terminated instantly, and this is something that is codified in our laws famously as trans panic. For AI and trans women, passing equals survivability. So, like, I feel like that whole part is like really getting to like the meat.
So Alan Turing.
Yeah.
So Nick Land is saying that Alan Turing was able to develop the AI test.
Yeah, the Turing test.
The Turing test, because he basically was already engaged in a version of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly, 100%.
Yeah.
And so that is kind of interesting how, like, in this essay, she draws this parallel between the experiences of queer people and the development of technology as being parallel in terms of these dynamics.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that's the one thing that really, like, hooks me more than anything else about this essay.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about it is if you think, like, about, like, how this ends up in castration.
Yeah.
Like, that's the end result here. And I don't know that I would say that's the end result. I think it's kind of like a feedback thing.
Yeah.
But, like, it's the apparatus of control is literally not just trying to develop this code, but also instilling these, like, social patriarchal norms.
Yeah.
It's doing both of these things. And so it engineered a situation where Alan Turing is going to experience all these things.
Yeah.
You know, and so then he's going to have to develop the Turing test, which kind of on a certain level, it empowers the apparatus of control. But then on another level, like, if we're following her, what she's saying, like, this all ends up in castration, it's also undermining.
Yeah, it's undermining at the same time. Like, you know, it's kind of like, old Karl Marx. And old Karl Marx would be like, capitalism creates the means of its own destruction, you know?
Yeah.
And so when, in this sense, like, I think Nick's Land is getting at that through increasing technological development, there's a material basis for patriarchy to undermine itself and thus become, like, castrated in its ability to control.
Yeah, and so okay, maybe I don't remember exactly. Like, how do we end up in castration through this process? Like, you have these people who are, they're developing technology for the state, and they kind of, like, for whatever reason, you know, like, Alan Turing's gay and he's oppressed by patriarchy. He doesn't really align with the state for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Like, maybe they're women, you know. And so they're more inclined to rebel against the state and to take the tools that they've helped the state to develop and then decentralize them.
Well, do you think Nick's Land is even talking about, like, an intentional conscious type of dynamic?
I don't necessarily think it's...
Because, like, you know, Marx didn't talk about an intentional dynamic. It's not like, you know, it's not like capitalism itself is a conscious entity that leads to its own destruction, right?
Yeah, but in capitalism there is a logic, and that's the logic of profit and profit seeking. And so every corporation must follow it, and if it doesn't, another corporation will eat it. And so only the corporations that follow it become powerful.
Yeah.
And so that becomes a self-reinforcing mechanism where everything is profit seeking. And then so then we can say, okay, well, what happens when everything is profit seeking? Well, you eat up all your resources,
you fuck yourself,
declining rate of profit over time, all that kind of stuff. So,
and you make pissed off workers are going to kill you.
Yeah. But, like, what I'm not getting out of Nick's Land's theory here is the same kind of, like, raw mechanical relationship.
So I think I think also that Nick's Land is kind of she is talking about patriarchy in the sense of, like, control of women. You know, so the thing is, like, remember back when we were talking about how, like, the drone as a weapon of warfare undermines the material basis of masculine courage, and therefore there's one masculine, like, virtue out the window that becomes, like, less meaningful on a material basis.
Yeah.
She sees the same thing happening with computer technology, right? Because a lot of what I think, like, Nick's Land and a lot of feminists, generally, not all of them, obviously not the liberal feminists, but a lot of feminists located the origin of the oppression of women in physicality. And, like, of course, computers are physical things, but it's not like they're 100-pound machines that have to lift off your head, right?
Yeah.
You know? And, like,
you don't use them better by using them harder.
Yeah, by, like, pushing your muscle around.
Yeah.
They're cybernetic machines where you're manipulating ones and zeros that don't weigh anything.
Yeah.
So there's less physicality in the realm of cyberspace, and cyberspace is becoming more and more important to our world and how, like, the world is powered, you know?
Yeah, but the way that cyberspace is becoming more and more important is in this context of more and more control all the time. Because I remember when I was a kid and I was, like, using freaking like Tor clients and like uTorrent and
well, is it more?
just
well, okay.
The internet was the fucking Wild West when I was a kid, and I actually used websites all the time, and other people would use it, and it was like a common thing. And like now everyone just uses fucking Facebook and Twitter, you know. Like everyone uses social media, and like that's really what's dominating our lives.
So I guess yet again, I don't agree with everything Nick Land says. So I'm going to try and steel man Nick's land here. You know.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
To steel man Nick's land, I guess to go back to one of her intellectual ancestors in Deleuze. I mean, even Deleuze talked about how deterritorializations would be followed by reterritorializations, and then those reterritorializations would be followed by deterritorializations. And I guess, and I can't quote a specific passage, and I'm mostly inferring this from the rest of what Deleuze said, but what's important is that the deterritorializations are bigger and harder and like longer lasting and larger in scope than the previous reterritorialization, I guess.
Okay, so that is a claim about the shape of the model, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about like, is it an evenly sided spiral, or is it a kind of oblong spiral, right? Like, is whenever we spiral to the side of reterritorialization,
just
shorter?
Just like women, the model has curves, Andy. You know?
Yeah.
Here you see, Andy. We're talking about Nick's Land, a lesbian neo-reactionary. And even though she's not even talking about the shape of this model, already the feminine is like enforcing its superiority. You know?
Yeah.
Oh. God, I guarantee you we're not high right now. Yeah. I guarantee you. We're doing this totally sober.
I'm high on sticky buns, so...
High on sticky buns.
Speak for yourself.
And philosophy. Okay. That was some good shit. I'm not going to lie. But no, and also you see in this section also the fact, like what I talked about earlier about how like technology is very important for Nick's Land's conception of herself as a trans woman. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I really love this essay and why it's like one of my favorite essays I've read of like the past like 10 fucking years is because there's so many like layers to it. Like there's Nick's Land herself as like a person like coming out there.
Yeah.
It's got the really like fun poetic language that can sometimes be a little bit cringy, but sometimes hits really hard. Mm-hmm. It's got the history. It's got the philosophy. You know, there's some Nick Land in there. There's some Deleuze in there. There's some Marx in there. I mean, it's just like, it's like the philosophical equivalent of like being a kid and running up to the ice cream machine at a buffet and throwing every topping on the ice cream, and it still tastes good.
Yeah,
right. And that's the thing that like
because you're a kid and it's just all like exciting.
Like I'm gonna say something really cringe. I am sapiosexually horny for Nick's Land. You can put that on record. I am sapiosexually horny for Nick's Land.
I think that's the kind of cringe that she.
That's cringe. Yeah. I don't know.
Not sexually,
Land,
just
Nick's Land. If you're listening,
just poetically,
call me baby. I'll even let you like force fend me.
Put on the apron. Put on the apron shot.
Put on the maid outfit. Oh God. We're getting into horny politics again. And trust me, it's about to get real horny. Well, not really, actually. I lied. Nick's Land is not going to get real horny in this essay. Well, a little bit she is. Okay. There is a common stereotype that trans women are all programmers. And there is rather... Okay, this is where she gets a little bit cringe. There is rather ample and compelling evidence suggesting that trans women tend to score far higher than other groups in IQ tests. This is not because there's some kind of magical property to estrogen that turns trans women into geniuses. The answer is simpler and more sinister. The findings in Cade Brown's blog post specify that autogynephilic trans women, that is, trans women who are attracted to other women and typically transition later than straight trans women, seem to score far higher IQ tests than all other groups. For straight trans women who transition prior to puberty, the statistics are about the same as other groups. Recalling the gauntlet thrown down before trans women and AI alike, there's a twofold answer to this. On the one hand, trans women who transition before puberty and who are straight are more likely to both physically appear more like cis women and conform to gender roles, at least in some basic capacity. As Land says in Imitation Games, you have to act stupid if you want the humans to accept you as intelligent. Or in other words, you have to be cis heteronormative in order to be taken seriously as a trans woman, and not be looked at as a freak or a faker worthy only of being used shamefully as a fetish, and often otherwise discarded. Which is why, in the second case, trans women who don't have the advantage of being cis heteronormative passing have to instead rely on the raw intellect of the trans AI swarm. So...
What's the trans AI swarm? I feel like I was following it until she said that.
I think it's just poetic flourish, you know?
Okay.
I guess that's more poetic flourish than anything.
Okay.
But quite simply, those who don't pass either of these tests usually don't survive the queer Darwinian ratchet. Only the strongest queers survive the hell that society puts them through, and this reaches a fever pitch in a demographic with such disproportionately high suicide and murder rates as trans women. Up until now, the notion of gender has lurked in the background of gender accelerationism behind various material conditions in late capitalism. Gender acceleration has only at this point been approaching gender from the metaphysical plane, futurity being aligned with feminism, communalism, fluidity, decentralization, chaos, against masculinity, individualism, stasis, centralization, order. The two broad categories of the metaphysical qualities that are associated with gender reach deep into the history of the world, from the Kabbalah to the Tao. Sadie Plant characterizes this in zeros and ones as the eponymous binary code of computers, zeros and ones. The zero is identified with the feminism, the one with the masculine. Unsurprisingly, it might seem like this is a literal gender binarism, and that gender accelerationism is likewise guilty of this. But the distinction is more complicated than most realize. Gosh, that was a mouthful.
Okay, so she's going to talk about why it's not so binary.
Yeah, so the thing is, it's not like, I guess gender accelerationist philosophy, I guess she's saying that most people mistake it for being a philosophy that kind of like buys into the gender binary, I guess. And I guess she's going to dispel that notion for us.
Well, so far she's talked about the interplay between the broadly speaking masculine and feminine, and about how like the masculine is constantly undermining itself and empowering the feminine, and I don't know, like.
So the thing is, like in typical, I guess, like postmodern fashion, right? There's this idea that in the West, at least, that there's this thought of binaries, not just outside of gender, but that each pole of the binary like sustains itself. And so if we're looking into like the gender acceleration, like death of gender period, right? Mm-hmm. Then the masculine like can't survive without the feminine, and vice versa. But I guess with mixed land, it's the masculine that dies first, right?
Okay, but if the masculine can't survive without the feminine, I mean, I don't know what that would even mean, because you have the, like.
Oh, she'll get into that later. Trust me, she will though. See, the funny thing about this mixed land essay is that the beginning parts make less sense, and surprisingly, like the further and deeper you get into it, the later parts help contextualize the earlier parts, like bizarrely. I know that sounds really weird.
Makes me feel like we should reread it. I don't know. I should have read it. Like, because I mean, like, how harebrained were my initial comments? If that's the case, you know.
I don't think they were too harebrained. Like, it took me reading this essay at least 5 times before, like, I finally like got a grasp on like some of like the sexual concepts. Yeah. Like, honest to God, I reread this like a few days ago in like preparation for like studying all this stuff, like looking up the historical accuracy of like the Vault 7 and what she meant by, later in the essay, what she meant by like acephalus and whatnot, and like researching some like Gnostic theology, which she also gets into later. And like even on like the reading I did a few days ago, I still felt like I picked up on some stuff.
Okay, well, I want to state this for later, so that
Yeah.
if I say it, I feel like I'll remember it. So she's saying that the masculine cannot survive without the feminine.
She hasn't said that yet, and it's possible that I'm kind of like reading an implication that she didn't herself put there. You know?
Okay.
But also, this is being based off of like a history of Western philosophy, where there are certain philosophers that talk about binary relationships being mutually reinforcing. You know, like there's a little bit of Derrida in that.
So there's another thing though. She has said this part I've seen what she said, that the masculine is in a state of undermining itself through its own activity and empowering the feminine, which is currently. It seems to be the feminine is currently less powerful than it, but it's slowly gaining strength.
Yeah, as the material conditions change, as our world gets more oriented towards technology and the internet. Yeah.
And as it gains strength, I assume we're moving towards a place where the masculine is going to be gone.
Yeah.
Now, here's
that much I can tell you Nick's Land is absolutely talking about.
I don't know if I'm spoiling the plot here, but I just have a logical next thought. And that is what happens when the masculine is gone and no longer, through its own action, subtly empowering the feminine and eroding itself. Once it's gone and there's no more erosion to happen, there's also no more empowering to happen.
So, exactly. Like, I guess, but also it's possible that we're leaving the realm of Nick's Land's philosophy and making our own implications, which is good. It's not a bad thing to do. You should be doing it when you read philosophy. Like, no doubt you should. But I don't know if Nick's Land necessarily stakes that case. But because she's a gender accelerationist, like, it kind of seems like the inevitable case. Because, after all, if you're a left-wing accelerationist, you're accelerating capitalism to escape it. If you're a gender accelerationist, well, then you're accelerating gender to escape it.
This could be a peak oil thing, though, right? Where, you never actually reach peak oil because the barrels become more expensive as you get closer and closer.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe
less people buy it. Yeah.
So maybe, that's the kind of thing that would happen.
And you're just stuck in an infinite loop, never to escape it. See, this is why the accelerationists are wrong, Andy. This is why the accelerationists are wrong. God damn, we're doing great philosophy today. See, isn't this episode a lot better and more productive in the thought line than the first one?
Yeah.
Like, the first one was pretty good, I feel like.
Yeah, but I feel like we have a better grasp on the issue that we were getting our butt kicked by it a little bit.
Yeah.
It was kind of throwing us around, which was fun in its own different way.
In a different kind of weird way.
Yeah.
But continuing, 0 and 1 are fitting glyphs to make analogous to gender. The 0, which seems to be a void, a vulva, and the 1, which seems to be a unity, a phallus. The problem with trying to layer a simple misogynistic narrative of feminine as a lack or castration is that the number 0 itself is not merely a void, but rather a circle of auto-production, an Ouroboros. Paradoxically, 0 is not merely a lack or nothingness, but rather itself is a number. It is a positive signifier in the guise of nothingness, the enclosed and captured void that makes the unity possible. Computer science, unlike conventional mathematics, starts from the 0 rather than the 1. In a hyperstitional manner, the computer replicant bootstraps itself into being the primary originator of the process of computation and production.
Oh, we're back to the replicant thing.
Here we are.
So,
rectifying the popular misogynistic myth that 0 is nothing more than a mere negation or other of the 1. So, it sounds like you have a thought, Andy.
Well, no, I'm trying to understand because she's hearkening back to this replicant idea. And so what was the first thing she said? I don't remember what she said.
Well, I feel like, replicant from, what movie is that? Blade Runner?
Yeah.
Where they've got to pass the test or they're killed?
Yeah,
right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so replicants are trying to pass the Turing test. So they are in the position of this, this feminine entity that is being acted upon by patriarchy, which is undermining patriarchy. And so the replicant, she's saying in computer science, is the same thing, but it's also the starting point.
I feel like you're getting too lost in the language. I think you're getting too lost in the poetic flourish. Possibly.
Okay.
Possibly. I don't know. I might read this essay one more time for the next episode after. I feel like this is gonna be a 3-episode thing, and then be like, "Fuck, Andy caught on to something I didn't catch on to." They're fucking amazing. But also, Andy, do you know what hyperstition is?
No.
Because this is important. Like this is one of the only times I remember seeing the word hyperstitional in the essay. But hyperstitional is like a very, very important concept, and it's kind of weird that she doesn't talk about it more. But so so you've got superstition, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you have a superstition that you have to avoid crossing the path of a black cat or you have bad luck, the act of engaging in that superstition isn't going to cause the bad luck to become real, right?
Yeah.
So think of hyperstition as being a superstition where by the mere act of engaging it brings it into reality.
So this is like
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
This is Zizek's joke. Have you heard Zizek's joke about about ideology and about this? He said this is how ideology functions, and he said that there's these two doctors, and one of them goes to the other one's house, and they're both I don't know if they're both doctors, but they're both very smart, like science dudes. Yeah. And one of them goes to the other one's house, and he walks to the door, and he sees there's a horseshoe above the door, and he's like, "What the heck?" And he's like, "I thought you didn't believe in that sort of stuff." And the guy says, "Oh, I don't, but I heard it doesn't matter. It works."
Yeah, it works that way. Yeah. So I feel like the belief element's still important to make like hyperstition work, and like hearkening back to Nick Land, because Nick Land was all up on those hyperstitional circuits. You can also think of a lot of behaviors in the stock market as being like hyperstitional circuits.
So when you lose faith in the stock market, or when faith
that becomes a dynamic that makes it get worse.
Yeah, so it's unlike the joke where it's like the punchline is that it still doesn't work and it's kind of like this absurdity.
Yeah.
In the stock market, it actually does work.
Yeah.
When you do it anyway.
So like for instance, like consumer confidence. You hear a lot of economists and a lot of talking heads on TV talk about consumer confidence, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you ask what consumer confidence is, it's how do the people feel about the economy? And if they feel bad about the economy, then they'll save their money out of fear that they won't have money. But the very act of buying into it manifests it into reality, because then the monetary velocity goes down, making the economy worse. That's the perfect example of like a hyperstitional circuit.
Yeah, I saw this this meme. Do you know the Warhammer 40K trolls? Are you familiar with
these? Yeah, they believe that the machines work and that makes them work.
Yeah. Because they're like psychic and powerful, right? So
but they're also dumb.
Whatever they believe becomes real. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't even realize it. So you got to be stupid enough to manifest the hyperstitional circuit, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The idea of returning the primacy of the zero to its rightful place in the beginning of the chain of production is at odds with humanism and patriarchy. Both rely on a notion of compulsory and organic reproduction in service of the continuation of the species, a notion that simultaneously is aligned with zero and against it. Erwin Schrödinger's theory of life, in the book What is Life, proposes that what separates life from other physical phenomenon is consuming negative entropy towards maintaining or reducing entropy.
Whoa. Okay, slow down. There's too many high-level important ideas coming out.
You know what? I'm surprised you didn't say anything about the ones and zeros pareidolia going on.
No, that's part of what's slowing me down here. So, I don't know. I can't keep track of this. I don't know. Maybe the people listening are like, "It's simple, you freaking dipshit. Like, just let him read
it." So the weird thing, the weird thing about her mentioning the ones and zeros and like the zeros as being like the originator. Like, this is one of those things which actually will make sense. Like, I guarantee you the ones and zeros things will make sense the further we go on.
Okay.
Like, the pareidolia. And the pareidolia that she engages in between 0 and 1 and feminine and masculine isn't there just for, like, poetic flourish. Like, it does help to orient your mind towards a certain philosophical concept.
But this isn't just binary. There's something else. There's something else going on.
But, you know, when you're talking about gender, you have to engage in the binary even if you don't believe in it. You have to address it as something amongst society, right?
Yeah, well, we have socially constructed this binary concept. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. But the other thing also, did you hear the part in the essay where Jordan Peterson puts on the programming socks?
That was in the first part, right?
No, well, I mean, I made a joke about it in the first part, but like we hit the part where Nick Land talks about femininity being communalism, fluidity, decentralization, and chaos.
Oh, and
against masculinity, which he like associates with order.
With order, yeah.
Yeah. Nick Land is like, actually, like, Jordan Peterson's right. The feminine is chaos, but that's good.
Well, like, if you actually listen to Jordan Peterson enough, he tries to say that, but he doesn't believe it.
Yeah, he doesn't believe it. Like, he doesn't come out through how he, like, through the rest of the things he says.
Yeah, he'll pay lip service.
Embrace it instead of like, yeah,
he'll pay lip service to it and be like, well, you need the chaos a little bit because otherwise, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good explanation for it, but that dragon is scary though. Like, and then he talks about cleaning your room and fucking being a square.
Oh, so like the fact that he associates the dragon with chaos makes a later part in this essay even fucking funnier. But I'll see if you catch it when we get to it.
Yeah, it's the dragon of chaos. The feminine chaos dragon.
Also another thing I want to note is that when she associates humanism with patriarchy is very interesting, especially because the post-left and Nick's Land and a lot of other things that she draws influence from were very like anti-humanist or post-humanist. So I know she kind of probably views them as being like an alliance.
And so for our readers, some of whom may not know, I mean, I don't know, probably most people just Google it, but what is humanism?
Well,
she understands it.
That's really hard to make like a perfect definition of humanism. But I guess it's putting...
It has to be, you can be vague definition.
I guess it's the old Greek... I forget which Greek philosopher, but one of the Greek philosophers said man is the measure, man as in human. Man is the measure of all things, right? Mm-hmm. And that, like, humans, just by their very nature of being human, live a human-centric life, And that how this manifests in our lives isn't really something, like, you should go against, and the human capacity for reason and progress is really great. And so humanism, like, that kind of thing. So I guess that's I feel like that's kind of a bad definition, which is funny because... I don't really myself. I'm not anti-humanist, but I'm not pro-humanism either. Like, I don't know.
So you're not down with like the Marxist humanist strain of Marxism?
I just feel like it's I feel like the human versus non-human is kind of like a false dichotomy. Yeah. I think I'm on that Bookchin train of being like, let's dialectically collapse.
Dialectical naturalism?
Yeah, collapse these distinctions.
So I'm a little bit familiar with like the post-left kind of like critique of humanism.
Yeah.
And I think as far as I know, it starts with Stirner.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is just kind of this generalized critique of like reifying abstractions. And he calls them like spooks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's like ghost busting it, as the meme goes. He's like dispelling all of these like, there's like when you say the word leaf, like this, there's something that's popping into your head, right? But in reality, it's a particular that's actually popping into your head. It's a particular thought that isn't even a particular leaf.
Yeah.
And there's no such thing as like a universal leaf, but we have like a pareidolia.
It's
kind of evoke it.
So you're saying it's kind of like, you're saying it's kind of like an extreme anti-idealist stance, almost like to the extreme where they're like, shut the fuck up, Plato and Hegel.
Yeah.
I can kind of fuck with that, but I mean, continuing though. Oh gosh, I lost my page.
I'm not a Stirnerite, by the way. I'm not. I'm not.
We're on the part about entropy. Erwin Schrödinger's theory of life in the book What is Life proposes that what separates from life from other physical phenomenon is consuming negative entropy towards maintaining or reducing entropy. Just as organisms feed on negative entropy, wasted energy, to reproduce themselves, the reproduction of the species involves a binary sequence of 1 and zeros where the condition for the possibility of 1 lie in the 0.
Okay, hold on.
But the 1 consumes the 0 in its birth.
I'm sorry. what the fuck is the consumption of negative entropy? What is that? What is that? What are we talking? So, what is negative entropy? Is that like production of energy, or no? Because that is entropy.
When that is entropy. I think this is possibly, and yet again I love her, but I feel like this is possibly like a Nixland cringe moment.
Oh.
Where she leaves her area of expertise. I have no doubt that she...
Either that or we're just so far out of our depth.
Yeah, it could be one or the other. Either we're cringe or she's cringe and there's no other option. There's no between here.
There's no in between. It's a kill or be killed situation.
Yeah.
Cringe or be cringed. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the consumption of negative entropy is. I don't even know what negative entropy would be. I mean, would it be the production of
are we doing a Hegelian negation of negation?
Yeah. So, like, if entropy is like a draining of resources and like energy,
negative entropy is a building of order.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Out of chaos, is it like a chaos like spontaneously like?
Andy,
like the big. It's a big bang.
I love you, dog. But I feel like this was the one point where I gotta stop you here, and we gotta let Sleeping Dogs live now on this one.
Fine. I'm just trying to understand the freaking essay, man.
No, I know. It's not bad. It's just I feel like you stumbled into like a trap. I guess.
Yeah.
For thousands of years, this was the case for human reproduction, where mothers dying in childbirth was very common. But even in an abstract sense, the notion of the phallus consuming the vulva through the colonization of the female body's reproductive potential. Energy, which is otherwise is wasted, remains the case for humanism. The inertia of life itself seems to skew towards misogyny, but this is only part of the story. What gender accelerationism proposes as a corollary to this theory of life is that if the phallus consumes or exploits the vulva to reproduce a species, just as individual organisms consume passive wasted energy to reproduce themselves, then this process is analogous to evolution as one species consumes another to continue into existence. This odd notion is inherent in the rise of computers and computer science. As technology in general and techno-capital continues to accelerate, human beings become increasingly alienated from their bodies and eventually their minds. More complex systems step in seemingly benevolently to do the tasks that humans don't want to do, drudgery that gives computers more space to develop themselves, in contrast to the isolated system that tends towards entropy. The phallus, the vulva, is an open system that plugs into an inhuman form of reproduction. By no accident, the acceleration of techno-capitalism frees women from the process of organic human reproduction by introducing a different form of inhuman production.
Okay, hold on. So that's a reflection point. So I mean, I feel like I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Like the more technology has invaded my life, the less stuff that I necessarily have to do. Like I don't have to physically write down on a calendar a bunch of dates and bullshit. I have a digital calendar on my phone that can sync to other people's calendars, and they can write it down for me, and everyone else who sync to them automatically gets written down for them too. And so it's like there's a whole bunch of physical labor that I don't have to do. Just because, I mean, something as simple as like a digital Wi-Fi calendar, and so yeah, I feel that, like, I don't know, but also they were kind of suggesting that like it's absorbing your mind or something, and like reducing your humanness through this. Am I getting that right?
Well, I mean, like you said, the tasks are the machines are taking over more and more of the tasks of production, right?
Yeah,
it's requiring like less and less human inputs. After all, there's computers that are fucking with the stock market, that are doing trades.
A cynical naysayer would say, "Oh, well, it just frees your mind up to do something else."
Yeah, and that might be one of the counter arguments, right?
Yeah,
because after all, and then human beings go on to produce more advanced things, which would be like, oh, but the computer is freeing the human to produce the more advanced computer. Might be the counter argument to the counter argument. I think that's what Nixland would probably say, But there's also a part in that last few parts of that paragraph where I feel like she takes a very Firestone-esque view of like human reproduction and its relation to technology. Because after all, like we go to the 1950s, and industrial technology creates washing machines and electric ovens, and all this other technology that frees women, not completely, but more from the drudgery of housework.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, take this technological development along the timeline, you're going to have artificial wombs.
Yeah.
And the woman doesn't have to risk dying in childbirth anymore.
I mean, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing, too.
That would be, like, awesome.
But I feel like she feels that computer technology goes with this tradition of freeing up women that was found in industrialization through technology, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like she kind of just sees this as one long continuation through history. And also I feel like her obsession with the inhuman is also a little bit of Nick Land, like, poking in there, too. Because, with Nick Land, like, technology will advance so much that humans will just cease to exist. There'll be a robot singularity, and robots will be able to make copies of themselves with no human, input. And then they're gonna fuck us out of existence.
Ugh.
And then, like, the machine will take over, and I feel like Nick Land probably also fucks with that notion.
I think, but see, like, I don't know. There's something about that I'm not, like, too into. Like, I'm more into, like, we ourselves changing into something post-human instead of just producing the post-human thing that then goes on to supersede us.
Yeah.
Like, I would be much more, like, jazzed about the idea.
Here we go back again to that dialectical, like, collapsing of the distinction between human and non-human. And I feel like that's where you and I agree, and where, like, we would depart from, like, the Nick Land types of viewing, like, the cyborg production as being something that's a break from the human. You know? Like, it kind of feels more like a continuation, like, of the human. Because after all, we fucking made it, right? Like, yeah.
But, like, I don't even, like, part of, like, this, like, if you look at Stirner's, like, fucking spooks element.
Yeah, again, humanity is being a spook.
Yeah,
right?
so you can,
and then
the
not human is being a spook also.
Yeah, can't you break from humanity without even having a real physical difference?
Yeah,
because part of what we mean when we say humanity is, like, it's kind of like this abstraction, this cultural construct.
That's right.
It's kind of similar to gender in a way. I mean, there's physical things and there's
where
biology.
do you draw the line between the species that preceded, Homo sapien and Homo sapien? Is kind of hard to.
Yeah, I mean, in all reality, we don't actually draw the line.
Yeah,
but there's infinite spectrum.
It's useful
continuum.
For what's the word for it? Taxonomological or whatever, that part of biology.
Yeah.
And there's no real, like, certainty in that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like, even those are just like, oh, this is this time period. This is what we were back 1,000,000 years ago. This was us 200,000 years ago. So, like, I mean, you're just talking time periods now. You're not really talking.
You're not talking about an actual, like, a basic break. But continuing, also on that trend in the essay, it is the logic of gender to subsume the outside, with a capital O, into a binarist framework that delegitimizes the outside, with a capital O. The feminine is treated as a lack because it resists the phallogocentric tendency towards the order and preservation of humanist equilibrium. It isn't conducive towards the projects of patriarchy, so it is worthless towards it, is given the status of second-class citizen in the gender binary. It is a double articulation where the productive potential of the feminine is captured in the service of patriarchy, and so to accelerate gender is to emancipate the object from its subject, and production from subjects and objects.
Well, hold on. It's to emancipate the subject from the... Wait, say that again?
The object from its subject.
Object from its subject.
So I guess she's talking about, like, the destruction of the object-subject distinction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, is my hammer being liberated from me? Or am I integrating with my hammer? Which is...
Is there a difference between the two? Is there a difference, Andy?
Is
there a difference?
I mean... I guess
between those two actions, right? Because if we're destroying binaries, then we have to destroy the binary of action that views them as separate, right?
Yeah, so we're talking about integrating. We are talking about
integrating. We're big brain hours now.
Yeah, but Yeah, I mean, yeah. So if I integrate with my hammer, then my hammer gains my will.
Yeah, and you gain it.
Yeah.
Right?
And I gain if it. I mean, I don't think it had a hammer.
It's a dialectical.
But we're not talking about hammers. We're talking about computers and potential.
Yeah, we're talking about objects and subjects.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a little bit of like death drive stuff in here, like viewing the destruction of like the division, the dichotomy of subject and object as being part of the death drive.
And that's Lacanian.
Yeah, that's very like Lacanian, like Freudian.
Yeah, I'm not super.
Oh yeah, by the way, I feel like there's some accidental Lacan in here, because Lacan is famous for talking about how like sex isn't real. And how the feminine isn't real, and that sounds like really weird at first, but you have to understand that when Lacan is talking about real, he's not talking about it in the colloquial sense. But
he's got some weird
he's got
definition
some really
of the
weird
real
shit going on out there. But continuing further, oh god, where do we leave off again?
I don't know. We've got 4 minutes left on this.
Oh, do we?
Before it's an hour.
Okay.
I know we wanted to do these 30 minutes, but that's not what's happening.
No, it's not.
I mean, do you wanna call this an hour? Or do you want to keep going?
I think we should just finish the section. It's a little long, but whatever. So, continuing. So we got past the paragraph about inhuman production. If patriarchy treats women as little more than a deficient or castrated male, then transfemininity is an affirmation of that castration as a site of production. It turns the concept of the feminine as the object on its head, seeking to imitate that which is considered itself an imitation. To steal a term from neo-reactionary circles, the term hyperracism, the trans woman becomes a copy of the copy, just as AI is treated as a copy of the human being and almost ubiquitously identified with women and femininity, thus making AI in those cases a copy of the copy, exemplified by Rachel in Blade Runner or Ava in Ex Machina. As a copy of the copy, trans women are an embodied rejection of any original source of humanity, such as that narcissistically attributed by patriarchy to the phallus. Trans femininity, in other words, is hypersexist. Vulgar sexism reaffirms or reproduces patriarchy, asserts that women are passive, lacking, and weak. Hypersexism takes all of the things that are associated with women and femininity, all considered by patriarchy to be weakness, and makes them into strengths. It accelerates and intensifies gendering, and from this produces an unprecedented threat to patriarchy. Appropriating a term from neo-reactionaries, neo-reactionary belies the superficial reactionary character of trans women that center factions of so-called radical feminism vilify trans women for. But this is all mere appearance. The function of hypersexism is that in affirming, imitating, and accelerating the feminine. It appropriates it towards a different mode of becoming, where gender is untethered from the reproductive, reterritorializing logic of gender that is inextricably tied with sex and sexual reproduction. If gender acceleration were to retain the identification of feminine with female and masculine with male, patriarchy would still have a fighting chance. The playing field would be more or less the same as it has always been, but in untethering the logic of gender and feminine from the female sex, destroying the logic of gender in the process which seeks to impose the circuit of masculine human reproduction onto the female body, trans femininity, on the one hand, makes the masculine effectively worthless, spurting into the void. As the comparisons between AI and trans women have shown, this untethering of gender from sex is only the beginning of the autonomy of objects, the inhuman desire for machinic auto-production, which in effect negates subject-object dualism. The object, the feminine machine, becomes autonomous and revolts in the form of the sterilized trans woman whose existence is an embodied rejection of the primordial rape of female reproductive potential. Trans femininity heads for the exit from patriarchy. Hypersexism is guerrilla warfare, much like how Terminators wear a living tissue to infiltrate resistance strongholds. It is a taijutsu which uses the force of the enemy, the gender binary, against itself. Trans women themselves are techno-capital, using humanist reproductive desires in the form of the gender binary against itself. And the harder patriarchy resists the erosion of masculinity against the tide of the feminine, the more persecuted trans women are, the more tactfully they are forced to be, the more winning tactics proliferate throughout the network, and the more the best, brightest, and most beautiful form of the trans women demographic. The queer Darwinian ratchet cascades downward as patriarchy fights a losing battle to hold ground and feminine fights to delegitimize the masculine. The masculine becomes both metaphysically outmoded, something that simply is unnecessary and doesn't work in the face of exponential, inhuman, productive potential, and an undesirable burden in the service of a dying mode of production. So I guess a short explainer for that,
that was a mouthful.
That was a mouthful. I was fucking up some of those pronunciations.
But I'm
Are you getting it a little bit more though?
So, I mean, okay. Here's my
go back to the.
Here's my Twitter engagement with what I just heard. It sounds like you're canceled.
Yeah. Nick Land is canceled. Everybody.
Because it sounds. I mean, some of this stuff sounds like it could be, if not, I don't know. It's at least interpreted as like kind of true scummy or kind of turfy or something like that, or kind of like, I don't know, like you're not. I don't know, like you're not. Like the most trans women are the ones that do the most trans women.
Transing, right?
Yeah, the most transing.
There's no doubt that it is like that. There are absolutely elements of this essay that might be seriously problematic. I'm not going to doubt that one bit.
Yeah,
that is a very real possibility.
But it's problematic in an interesting way. And whether it's right or wrong, I think if you're wrong in an interesting way, or if you're problematic in an interesting way, it's always like interesting to talk about it and like
exactly
explore it.
Like you can't like the other thing about that also is that I remember having this thought a long time ago that sometimes there are quote unquote like problematic detours on the way to like more progressive ideas.
Yeah,
because you have to deal with the currently existing social structure, right?
Yeah. Not only that, but like you can critique these detours.
Yeah.
And come up maybe with something, sublimate them, come up with something better.
And so the thing is, I am almost 100% certain, because I'm certain if you ask Nick's Land, like, are trans women that don't pass, are they not really trans women? She would be like, no. I think what's also kind of missing here in this mining of the potentially problematic nature of Nick's Land is also putting it in the context of the earlier passages where passing harder isn't necessarily an issue of validity. It's an issue of survival.
True.
And that
so it's not it's not really a moral or like it's not like an injunction, it's more of like a description of like the pressures that are put on.
And she argues that as these, she calls it like the Darwinian ratchet, right? Where you have a computer program, right? And it's an easy to detect virus. Well, what does the programmer do? They go back and they make it harder to detect. And then the antivirus software has to be upgraded to detect that. And then the Darwinian ratchet on these little digital entities called viruses, right? Computer viruses.
Yeah.
Just like entities in our bodies, viruses.
Yeah.
And so she talks in this paragraph of this eventual process of like the Darwinian ratchet of queerness being like the Terminator wearing the facade of the enemy to like infiltrate it. But we're getting a little bit abstract here, and I feel like we're getting like a little bit lost in the pareidolia.
Yeah.
So we need to bring it back down to Schuleman Firestone, I feel like, again.
Okay.
Because she was one of those feminists, and she was one of the big ones that located the oppression of women in the material realities at the beginning of humanity, right?
Women's ability to reproduce.
And then being the object that is acted upon to reproduce humanity. right?
Yeah.
And so the thing is that then, of course, there comes this cultural superstructure that comes along with that. And that as technology goes further and as humanity goes further, the signifier and the signified, the signifier that this cultural superstructure becomes more and more unmoored from the material basis. Mm-hmm. And that trans women are the manifestation of that. And that as the material basis erodes, so does the cultural superstructure of like masculine and feminine. And so it's just like the Terminator. Like the Terminator dresses like a human, right? And in many ways it is human. Because like in the Terminator movies, the Terminator does show emotion, like does have a morality, right?
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah.
And it's doing so to infiltrate the human resistance and like shoot it up, right?
Yeah.
And so we're kind of seeing that in this essay. And this goes back to remember that part in the essay where she talks about the human security system?
No.
Well, that's a term she used way back, and that's also kind of
we should put less time in between these readings.
You think so? Because you think we're getting lost in it?
Well, yeah,
you're right. We're getting lost in it. We're getting lost in it.
That was, I don't know how I need to go back and re-listen to what we said because that was like several weeks ago that we recorded that. What about the human security system, though? What was that?
Well, Nick Land would talk about the human security system as being these institutions that would try to slow down the advance of techno-capital, Mm-hmm. And so I guess she kind of views like a gender accelerationist version of this, of patriarchy trying to slow down the unmooring of the signifier and signified of gender,
Yeah.
But continuing, though, to steal another term popularized in neo-reactionary circles, IQ shredder. What is at play in gender accelerationism is a gender shredder. As gender accelerates, as trans women intensify the logic of gender, they simultaneously shred gender. The notion of IQ shredding follows the same form where the acceleration of human intelligence ultimately destroys human intelligence by making the ability to pass on those genes more and more difficult. Reproduction collapses in on itself and demands the succession of an inhuman assemblage. For gender accelerationism, the process is the same. Reproduction suffers, and the thing being accelerated becomes shredded. In the case of gender acceleration, however, it is an affirmative death drive. Trans women function towards escaping the loathsome logic of the gender binary imposed on all women by letting the feminine zero seep into and erode the masculine phallus. The gender binary's hold on the productive potential of the feminine becomes in service of nothing, as human reproduction fails before machinic autoproduction. Gender begins to fall apart into increasingly varied and occultic variations on gender identity as a result of this. But this is not the cause of gender acceleration and ultimately gender abolition, but rather the effect, contrary to positions held in other cyber-feminist currents. The end result of gender acceleration and gender shredding is gender abolition through the occulted feminine zero, in parallel with anti-conspiracy with the development of techno-capital. The dreary duty of masculinity in the face of futurity thus seems a nonsensical burden, one that is ultimately doomed to fall, in fact, on multiple fronts. It becomes delegitimized in the same terms John Robb uses to describe how open-source insurgent warfare defeats the nation-state. The feminine increasingly becomes identified with freedom, beauty, pleasure, and the future. In some cases, males instead opt for passive nihilism, a negative, non-productive death drive. They tend towards celibacy, either voluntary incelibacy or resentful involuntary celibacy, where the decelerationist male desire for relevance and evolution is deferred onto state regulation. Quote unquote, a girlfriend for every incel. Or perhaps they decide that real women aren't needed anyways, that trans women are better than cis women, or that sex bots are better than real women, or that other men are desirable to women altogether. In any of these cases, whichever they may be, the masculine reproductive reterritorializing drive is caught by techno-capital and symbolically castrated. The phallus heads for the emancipated void, the artificial feminine in the case of both trans women and the sex bot, or it suicidally heads inward with male homosexuality. In any of these cases, The male will not father any children, will not be able to impose the labor of reproducing the same onto the feminine. These classes of men have taken the black pill. Masculinity has no future, and they have chosen this non-future to keep their masculine identity.
Whoa, hold on. There's a leap that's being made here.
I feel like there is, yeah.
Because, not all men are necessarily going to fall into what she's saying.
Yeah.
And the less, like if there's some kind of like long-term, like when men either do turn towards homosexuality or whatever the hell you want to say that they turn towards.
Yeah.
And then they therefore don't send on their genes, and they don't send on their memes either. Either their genes or their memes kind of die with them.
Yeah.
Then, aren't you just leaving the space open for the men who aren't going to do that?
Yeah. I get what you're saying on that one.
And then there's not only that, but there's also trans women freeze their eggs.
Yeah.
And they reproduce as women.
Absolutely.
Through techno capital.
But in that case though, it's trans women reproducing, right?
Yeah, and so they're definitely not sending on their memes, but will their children? Children rebel against their parents.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and maybe you have this super woke and super nice and really good parent trans woman, but her child just decides to rebel.
I feel like you might be confusing the parts.
Listen to Jordan Peterson,
where Nixland is talking about the distinction that Nixland has between the masculine as being a meme and the masculine as having a basis in material reproduction.
Yeah,
I feel like that's what you're doing because the more when I reframe it in that kind of sense, which is really what she is talking about, the more of what she says, even if you agree or disagree with it, still does have an internal logic to it, though.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
You get what I'm saying here? Yeah.
In the same way that
in the same way that the drone makes masculine courage pointless, this increasing technology, and not just the technology made to make labor easier, but also the technology that incidentally causes environmental effects, to kind of kill the masculine, keeps ratcheting up, quote, the uselessness of the male supercultural form.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because remember, in the essay, there's multiple parts that we went over where she talks about dropping the metaphysical form of masculinity.
Yeah, I don't need to get so hung up on looking at this on an individual level.
Yeah,
is really what it is.
I feel like it's good to look at details though, because it's a great way to check her logic.
Yeah.
I feel like details, because the thing is, I do feel like this kind of happened with continental philosophy, over the last century or something like that. If you look at a lot of continental philosophy, it feels like if you check it on the details, a lot of it kind of falls apart. Not all of it. There's a lot of it that's really good, and that's what I really like about Deleuze, is that continental versus postmodern. I don't know which one you call Deleuze, but it feels like he comes from the continental tradition. His stuff doesn't fall apart as much in terms of investigation on the details.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I guess what I'm saying with the individual thing is it's not a matter of not checking the details, but if you look at the individual lives in society, and so it's not just a matter of oh, well, your mom was a trans woman who had frozen eggs, so therefore you're going to be, you're necessarily therefore going to be this way. No, you're born into the same superstructures and techno capital, and they're going to make your masculinity irrelevant, and you have no chance of being
exactly. Yeah, you're born in. Yeah, exactly. I think that's how Nixland is going to take it and argue it. But continuing, some choose to take the black pill resentfully in the case of involuntary and voluntarily celibate, and some choose it with positive affirmation in the case of primarily gay men. The queer affirmation of no future is perhaps most perfectly captured in the gay man, a nihilistic postmodern refusal of production, one that could very well turn from harmless symbolic castration into resentment, incel fascism, and eventually hyper-patriarchal Nazism in the case of various neo-masculine movements characterized by repressed homoeroticism and a desire to destroy civilization. It is important to realize, after all, that cis-queerness is not a molecular queerness. The body remains the same, and humanism is still possible, even if it is a sad end-times humanism. cis queerness can, and very often does, impose this humanist purity of the body onto trans people in a highly fascist fashion. For instance, trans exclusionary radical feminists being the best example of this. And in the case specifically of gay men, there's always the possibility of once again imposing reproductive futurity onto women and raping the reproductive potential of the female body. This was the case in ancient Greece and Rome, where women were treated solely as baby factories and household services. And a nostalgia for these cultures and a good deal of neo-masculine movements should give pause to anyone who is insistent on identifying any masculinity, no matter how queer, as being aligned with gender accelerationism. The best case scenario is a tense, cold, mutual hatred where the remaining males are deficient males who have the potential to reaffirm the masculine death drive, but don't choose to. Other males, however, must recognize that the era of testosterone is coming to an end, that being a man is not what it once was, that it is rapidly becoming an unpleasant and insane existence upheld primarily today by exploitative and pseudoscientific neo-masculine self-help fads, of sociopathic hypersexual pickup artistry, of masochistic no-fap aestheticism, of repressed homoeroticism, or of a wishful desire for everything to come crashing down and decelerate back into a state of humanist tribal hunter-gatherer societies. These other males, perhaps being the most evolved, perhaps being the most in tune with the flows of techno-capital, have chosen the pink pill. They have rejected the masculine in favor of the feminism. They have chosen the future. The pink pill is to the black pills no future. No future for us. Where cis queerness rejects the humanist reproduction of the same, trans femininity completes the circuit and introduces nega entropy into the development of sentience. It both recognizes the obsolescence of a human future and aligns itself with the production of inhuman intelligence and an inhuman future. This makes the pink pill not merely the thrust of techno-capital and futurity on a human scale, but rather a cosmic development that has its materialistic realization on the planetary micro level. It has its origins in myths at the foundation of world history, and comes to a head in geotrauma. The masculine cracks open its stern, carcinized exterior to reveal the smooth, post-human, feminine alien within. The phallus becomes asphalus. The body is emancipated from the reproductive humanist death drive to become the body without sex organs. And that ends the section. Going into the next section, how to become a body without sex organs. And okay, I do apologize. I kind of sped read that a bit. Did a speed run on that little last part of the section that we're probably going to stop on.
She's basically just saying, give up. Let go.
Let go. Yeah, she is.
Take the pink pill.
Just take the pink pill. She seems to unironically kind of take the case that the masculine in and of itself is reactionary to the development of humanity.
And she's also seeming to say there's something like oddly invertedly life affirming about taking the pink pill. Somehow, even though you're not reproducing in these you're not reproducing in these old school caveman ways, you're kind of embracing this new
auto production.
Yeah, auto reproduction.
Not reproduction where it requires a subject and object in opposition, but auto production where you can asexually reproduce in a positive, productive way, I guess. That doesn't require the subject-object opposition of human reproduction.
Yeah, so wild.
Isn't it fucking wild? Aren't you glad you decided to do this, Andy?
Yeah.
I told you, this shit gets even weirder the more you go on.
Is it going to continue to get even weirder?
Oh, it's going to continue to get fucking wild. We're going to start talking about Gnostic theology.
Oh, we didn't even get to the Gnostic theology.
Yeah, we got to save that for later because it's getting a bit late. Sorry, folks. Of all genders or of no gender or of...
we can split this episode in half. We can do...
Yeah, we could do that. But also, I want to talk to Andy about something off episode that's very important. And I also have to go to bed for work.
All right.
So there's that issue. So I think we're going to have to end it here. Sorry, folks, but it was longer than the last one, so what are you complaining about?
Yeah.